Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Corey. I work here at the Monroeville Library. Tonight, we are having Reverend Scott Gallagher, who we welcome for joining us this evening from the United Methodist Church. So I think with that, we will just give the floor to him.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for coming out tonight. I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks for filming.
Don't worry, I'll make you look good.
Okay. I was wondering where to start this evening with the Methodist and the understanding of the United Methodist Church specifically. But in order to do that, I thought it may be good to allow you to know a little bit about me and why I am a United Methodist pastor rather than any other denomination that I could have chose. I was baptized Presbyterian. I was part of the Presbyterian Church until I was 11 years old when my family moved to Grace United Methodist Church in Cole Center, Pennsylvania, right outside of we call it Little California, but I guess down in Monroeville it's just California, PA. That was the church that I was confirmed in. The folks at that church had a profound effect on my life. The pastor that was there was a pastor that was able to draw 5 United Methodist churches together and create a new church. That's why the title was Grace. There's a lot of grace to make that happen. Then throughout my teenage years, I drifted away from the church, and by happenstance, I began to work with an individual at Montgomery Ward when I was working as an auto mechanic that invited me to go to his church, which just happened to be Grace United Methodist Church in Cole Center. Whenever I went back to the church, there were all those fond memories of being there, and I found a new connection to the theology that was being offered in the Wesleyan tradition, that even in the midst of all my stumbling along in life, I was able to find a place in the church, in a community that was accepting. A little bit of backtracking on that story. Whenever I was 12 years old, I felt a call into the ministry. My father was the custodian of the church, and my job was to go through all the pews during the week and take out all the bulletins that everybody left behind and the little candy wrappers and things like that. And one afternoon, I snuck up into the pulpit, and I say I gave the best sermon that's ever been given in the face of the earth. Nobody was there to hear it. My father came up around the corner and told me that was no place for me. He also worked as a carpenter, and his words were, "There's no place for a carpenter's son," which is a little bit ironic. But then after I got back to the church, that calling started to fill my spirit once again. I started recognizing it, and God opened up all kinds of doors. My stubbornness of trying to raise a family, going to school. God made it so that I wasn't able to work as a mechanic anymore. I had a back injury. I wasn't allowed to stand too long, lean too long, sit too long. So couldn't work over my head. That eliminated the opportunity to be a mechanic. So God said, you're supposed to be listening to me. And found my journey and continue as I studied more and more into Methodism and the Wesleyan tradition itself. I found more of myself revealed in that theology, and knew that it was not only something that I could believe in, but something that could compel me to share it with others in such a way that I could bring my life experience into the midst of the story, into the midst of the life of the church. So that's how I got to where I am. There's a number of things with the Methodist Church. We have a habit historically of dividing, splitting, coming back together, dividing, splitting, coming back together, and as you've seen on the news, there's all kinds of potential for that in the near future. One thing that is beautiful that I find about Methodism itself, there's room for everyone at the table. Our theology of communion is an open table. I think that extends more than just the sacrament of communion. The open table speaks that everyone is invited to the Lord's table, to the Lord's house. So I think that there is enough room to have differing theologies, perspectives, and interpretation of the scripture and still be within one family. together. That would be my dream, is for the church to become like that, but it may not be possible at the current time. That's just a little brief introduction. I am here to answer your questions more so than you to know all about me.
Okay.
Unless you want me to address my tattoos now.
I'll ask if nobody else does.
Okay.
I'm sure. So, do we have any questions?
Yeah, I would like you to go into the polity issue, the worldwide fellowship, and where we're used to, in the Lutheran tradition, we have our Lutheran churches in North America.
Okay.
And then we have the Lutheran World Federation. It's now Lutheran World, it's really a communion of churches, not a federation. And so that's my basic question for being here tonight.
Okay. In the Methodist tradition, that's connectionalism. That we celebrate, that all of our churches are connected through our shared polity, through our shared discipline. Currently, we're working out of the 2016 discipline, which it's our rule book,
Yeah,
more or less. What we, as the church expanded and as evangelism is a big part of Methodism, and as the church began to grow and the global community began to expand, we still have the tenets of our faith and the perspective of our theology that unites us together. But what also unites us together is a common ordination. So an ordained elder or ordained deacon in the United Methodist Church that ordination is recognized throughout the conferences where you're able to serve. So there's a connection that exists there. Now, granted, we divide everything up into conferences. I should explain that.
That's worldwide, or just is that the term in North America?
Yes. Conferences is the theme. To give you an understanding so that I can explain more about that. We're part of the Greensburg District. Garden City United Methodist Church is part of the Greensburg District. We have a district superintendent. Now, the Greensburg District extends from Garden City is the furthest towards the city. That runs right next to the Pittsburgh District. And we travel all the way out into Latrobe area. I'm trying to think how far south we go.
That's okay.
So we're divided up into districts. Our districts come together in Western Pennsylvania to form the Western Pennsylvania Conference of the United Methodist Church. Now that conference goes from the Ohio border, the West Virginia border, up to Erie, the New York border, down through about a third of the state. Then our conferences form jurisdictions. So each small conference is part of the jurisdiction. Our jurisdiction is the Northeast jurisdiction. So we have West Virginia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Delaware, Maine, the New England states. They're part of one conference. That's the Northeast jurisdiction. All the jurisdictions within the United States, they come together as part of the General Conference. The General Conference is a gathering that not only do the jurisdictions in the United States, all the conferences of the United States are part of, but also our global community, our central conferences. Our central conferences are the United Methodist churches that are outside of the continental United States. So we have the different conferences in Africa are part of a central conference. The Eurasia. So those central conferences are also part of the General Conference, which is our ruling body that meets every 4 years and seeks to perfect this book. It's thought that this book is rewritten every 4 years. It's not the ongoing pressure to perfect what's in here and to recreate that. Now, as I said, the ordination that helps keep our connection together. It's not that I can just go to another conference and serve a church, because we do have bishops for each conference. Some conferences share a bishop who have a point of authority. As pastors in United Methodist Church, we're appointed to churches, which means the bishop and the superintendents come together. They discern where the pastor's gifts and abilities could best be used or best matched to a particular congregation or area in which the church is. If there's no major issues, then the appointment happens. I am a member of the Western Pennsylvania Conference, so in order for me to serve in another place, I would have to transfer or be loaned out to one of the other conferences. But I would not have to go through another ordination process or interview process for that. So the global connection, we're bound together by a common theology that has cultural differences. Mean by that is our central conferences. This is the book of discipline that is approved by General Conference, but there are some things in this book of discipline that do not speak to other cultures, such as countries in Africa that have laws that are prohibitive from things that are permissible in the book of discipline. They can make adjustments so that their discipline is in accordance with local law, local customs, and traditions. So the central conferences have that ability. The conferences within the United States don't have that ability to make adjustments to the discipline. Okay. There's a whole lot of words. And I know I throw things out there, and there's phrases that if you go, you're talking Methodist, open that up. I'm more than welcome to do my best.
I thought it was very helpful. So, do we have any other immediate questions?
When did Methodists become distinct from Episcopalian / Anglican?
Well, that's a complex. Now, if you want to draw that distinction between Methodism and the Church of England. Is that the question you're looking at?
Yeah.
You can generalize that right around the Revolutionary War.
Okay.
The roots of Methodism are not Anglican or of Church of England. The roots of Methodism are a interdenominational process. When Wesley gathered and when Charles invited John to be a part of the Holy Club, it was not just Anglican priests that were part of that, or Anglicans. You had Presbyterians. There was some level of Baptist influence that existed there. So the Methodist movement itself was not a denomination. It was a movement within, and a gathering of people who searched to do something with their faith rather than exist within a structure of a church. So the original Methodist, you went to a meeting, class meeting that they be referred to, that you held each other accountable to make sure you're living out your faith. But then you went to worship at your house of worship, wherever that may be, and with whichever denomination that was part of. So we were a movement that got a little bit with Wesley. John Wesley had a unique ability to take control of things, and as it became more and more attached to the Anglican Church, as there was some division over predestination and other theological stances that he couldn't come to agreement with, and as the church came to the colonies, and there was rumor of the Revolutionary War coming, then there had to be a division, because if you're in the colonies, you're part of a revolution to become your own, and that priest is part of the nation that you're trying to separate from. So that started to be a little bit of division. There's a difference between the Methodist Church in Britain and the United States. There's we're different flavors of the same ice cream. But the short answer, the Methodist movement that we're most aware of would be post-Revolutionary War and those foundations. As a denomination, as a specific church.
How many hymns did Charles write?
Far too many to count.
I know.
Yeah, I think there was something in Charles that if he put more than 2 or 3 sentences together, he could sing it. So oftentimes I read the letters that Charles wrote, and even John, as he tried to be a hymn writer, I wonder how did you say these, because it's such a poetic way of stating things. Did he hear it musically? Same thing with the sermons that were shared to be read, not necessarily spoken. But how did he? I think it'd be magnificent to see somebody with that much musical talent be able to speak their message, almost like the hum in the African American tradition of the church, is what I imagine. Anyhow, I have no basis to say that.
Now, I've heard that in my tiny bit of research that the term Methodist originally came up because they were considered to have a very methodical approach to their faith. Is that true?
Yes.
And can you expound on that at all?
Yeah. The Holy Club would gather, and there were distinct things that were going on. And Wesley would celebrate Sacrament Communion each morning. There was a particular way in which you're going to study the Scripture. There's a particular way in which you're going to live out that Scripture, and the accountability. So they were very methodical, and it was a pejorative type of statement. It was, oh, you're one of those Methodists. It definitely wasn't something that necessarily started out as a badge of honor to run around. It was, oh, you're one of them. So the Methodist movement, if you want to look at it from that way, has always been a fringe movement, and also working within the fringes of society. When Wesley saw that the church that he was serving as an Anglican priest was not visiting the imprisoned, was not caring for the widows, was not caring for the needy and sick, he intentionally went out and did that. So he was among the excluded from the general society.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting to take something that someone used as a pejorative against you and say, well, we'll just lean into that.
That's been very common in church history.
Mm-hmm.
Protestant was the protesters.
Yeah.
Before we ask any more questions, what would you like to talk about?
I'm here to answer whatever questions.
Were you hoping there'd be any particular questions?
I'm open to anything.
If I cannot answer it, I will say I can't answer that.
Well, let's go back because I'm a little confused. You talked about the
Good discipline.
The book of discipline. So I was it 2 summers ago, St. Louis?
February 19th, the special general conference.
Yeah, that was worldwide, right?
Yes.
But if there's freedom within, they have the cultural variance in the book, then how could we, the whole, impose on the specific?
That's a very good question. It's a challenging question. It's one of the challenges about being a global denomination.
Yeah.
Because as we approach 2020 as our regular session of the general conference that's coming up, we have at the beginning of our book of discipline our social principles, and they outline where we stand on real life things. Where the church stands on abortion, the church stands on science and religion, our church stands on all these things that are going to come in contact with everybody
of the worship setting as much as possible. And we realize that it is very U.S. centric in that there are things in our social principles that have no application outside of the United States, or very little application. So the process was begun in 2012 to begin to look at the social principles. It was more it was made more concrete in 2016 to have a proposal for the 2020 conference on a new social principle for the church that could be globally maneuvered. We know that we have issues with that. Now, I think that as the church began to expand globally, the original voting rights was depending on how much membership you have in each conference determines how many delegates you have to our general conference, and that population is between clergy and laity. So there's a matching number of clergy and laity. As the central conferences began to grow exponentially, we realized that we're not showing equal representation for the churches outside of the United States. Thus, our book was U.S. centric. So some of those adaptations were an early realization that the book is written for the United States, and the global church is growing. We also had improper rules on voting members, on how delegates were chosen from the central conferences. So they weren't represented in an equal manner between membership numbers and delegates to the general conference. So the U.S. delegates could control the process of things. As we began to balance that out, and the central conferences began to grow in membership and numbers, then it became a counterbalance where they had more authority in the operation of the book of discipline, even though there is some level of cultural adaptability outside of the U.S. So I think it's where that some of that is an unintentional effect of trying to have equity in the body, not realizing that we needed to make a few more changes. Ideally, and one of the things that one of the number of plans coming up in 2020 is finding out a way that the U.S. would be a central conference and be able to adapt the book of discipline to the culture in the U.S. and so that there'd be a little bit more balance that way. But you want to have that in a global church. You want to have that uniting feature. There are some items in the discipline that you're not going to change. But the majority of the things can be adapted. If you consider, one of the things in the social principles, if you consider discussion on universal health care, in the language in the discipline, is speaking to things that are foreign to those outside of the United States. What's this idea of universal health care when you're trying to establish a healthcare system at all in your area? So did that answer that?
Your answer helps.
Okay.
Agree.
It's a very complex type of dynamic.
And as you were talking, the thought came to me in the denomination that I'm in. We have been producing social statements. They do not have the status of doctrine, but they are a statement by assemblies on certain a specific social issue.
Yes.
So a member in a local congregation can take this statement and dialogue with it to help them come to their own understanding, and that's the way we are seeking to deal with social issues.
Yeah. Remember how I said that, Methodism had an influence from a number of different denominations? And that's also reflected in the fact that we have the Book of Discipline with our social principles, and then we also have this book, the Book of Resolutions. The Book of Resolution is also something, as you're saying, it's not doctrine of the church, but it's a guiding feature for living out what is presented in here. For instance, just the one that I turn to is rights for farm workers in the United States. That you don't necessarily need that to be a part of the Book of Discipline, but it is important for the church to be able to speak into real life situations that somebody may be dealing with that may not be something in an urban setting that is necessary, but it is necessary in a number of other areas in the life of the church. So we do have the Book of Resolution, which speaks to those same things.
It'd be just that would be a type of issue, a social statement.
Right. Yes.
But when our churchwide assembly adopts it, requires a 2/3 vote.
Okay.
So when you're studying it locally, you're dealing with, leadership is of this frame of mind.
Sorry. And in the same way, we have this resolution that's of the United Methodist Church. At our conference that gathers once a year, the annual conference has the opportunity to adopt resolutions also to speak to very specific things for Western Pennsylvania or the state of Pennsylvania. One such document that comes up is a resolution is standing against the death penalty. Making sure that language is appropriate for what the laws are currently. If there's a change in the law, and those resolutions often, speak to encouraging members of the church to speak out to their representatives for the state. And now on the local level, there's less of that happens with local churches taking up specific resolutions to speak to community needs, because we have that opportunity to be present, such as here in Monroeville. If there's an issue that's involving the Monroeville directly, we've had the opportunity to go and address things with council, go and address things to the school district, and if we have an understanding from the congregation, then we can share that as a leader of the church, as long as it also is within the direction of here. So you have that overarching structure that you maintain within.
So on sort of political issues like that, is it more that the church encourages individual members to participate in the political process, or does the church try to have a voice itself?
I'm glad you asked that. We encourage members to be active in the political environment of the local community, the state community, the national community, global community, and to use the voice that we're given to affect and have influence in that. Methodist Church is uniquely positioned because we have always been in the states directly involved in politics. John Wesley, even whenever he was, whenever it seemed to be a rift between the two movements, spoke out against slavery, and actually condemned the United States for the practice of slavery. He was also part of the movement in England to abolish slavery in England. You might get a little hint of that in the movie Amazing Grace, that leans, at least opens up the door that there was part of that. The Methodist Church, I have to be careful, the United Methodist Church didn't form until 1968, so the preceding churches, they were involved in the civil rights movement, they were involved in the temperance movement, they were involved in the women's rights movement. If you name any large movement in that you can recall, the Methodist Church was front and center in that. So much so that we own a building right behind the Capitol. So if you walk out of the Capitol Hill, where the senators walk in the back door, the one building you're going to see is a United Methodist building. That's where our social justice agency is. So a number of United Methodists that participate there have a direct contact with senators and congressmen as they come in and out for their daily work to advocate for laws. The sign out front. Churches always like those little catchphrases. Well, the phrases that are on front of ours stand up for our social justice principles. And if there's a vote going on, in the Capitol on immigration, then our statement about immigration is going to be right there front and center. The church has been offered phenomenal amounts of money for that building, and we will not let it go because having the presence there is important. And there's ecumenical efforts that go on there, and even though the denomination, we open it up just this. There's conflicting views. For instance, whenever we're looking at abortion within faith communities, there's the official stance of the United Methodist Church, which is kind of the both and. But we opened up the building to a very conservative group to lead a worship service and to have a speaking engagement while they were there, for the March for Life. So although the building's there and there's one purpose for it, there's also a purpose of it being there to be open and for the church to remember that we are an open table and to keep open ears, and to hear each other and to support that. So.
Thank you. That's very interesting.
What are the white books sitting in front of you?
These white books, if you've heard on the news about our general conferences coming up, you're going to hear about human sexuality being the debate that could divide the church. These books here are the legislation that's going to be voted on at that general conference. This is not all about human sexuality. It's the rewrite of the social principles. There's pension things that are in there. There's how are we going to, use the funds that we have available, what the rulings on church property, and, how we're going to set up our general agencies. There's, I believe, 1,800 pages worth of legislation that'll be taken care of during that 10 days, week-long process that exists there. So there's a whole lot more going on in the life of the church than that. Stance on, making sure that we're dealing with systemic poverty and racism and everything that's going on in society that they'll address. So if you hear that, the news likes to catch a story, and sometimes it just feeds in. We got a lot going on in the church, and a lot that we're in agreement on in the life of the church. So that's what those are. You can download it in PDF form from umc.org, but it'll cost a lot of ink and a lot of trees.
Are you a delegate for that?
No, I am not a delegate, but I have vested interest in the decisions and what's being decided. So I'd like to be aware of what's going on. And
so in your polity, does each congregation own its own property?
we are stewards of that property.
Okay.
Every local congregation is responsible for the purchasing of the land, constructing the building, maintaining the building, whether it's the church building itself or the parsonage, if they have one for the pastor to live within. However, John Wesley in his infinite wisdom developed that has to be included in all Methodist and subsequent churches, what's referred to as the trust clause, which means we hold that building in trust of the denomination that we're part of. So if a local church would just decide they want to sell the building and use the money for something, you can't without permission. You could sell the property, but the money can only be used for other capital expenses, building a new building, things like that. If the church would disband and just abandon the building, then in our area, the Western Pennsylvania Conference would then be the stewards of that. there's a thought that if the church abandons the building, then the conference owns the building. The conference is still the steward of the building because the actual owner of the building would thus be General Conference, but General Conference won't assume that liability. They have the right to sell the building. Our particular conference put through a resolution a few years ago that if a church is abandoned and sold in an urban area, those funds need to be brought back in for work of the church within an urban area, so that we can continue a presence, in the cities where the church may. If you see some of our city churches, they're large structures. The attendance in the city churches is lower because it's just so hard to get in and out. Who wants to pay, $20 to go to worship on a Sunday morning? More so if there's a Steeler game going on. But that money still stays in to do ministry in that area.
I know you addressed some of this already, but could you say a little more about the movement that led to the break with Anglicanism in England, the principles that animated that movement? What were the issues? What was the break about? And also the class character of the movement. Was it more because Methodists, or the movement was more, Anglicanism was perceived as an elite religion, and Methodism was more geared towards the working class?
Okay. It's complex. If I hate to oversimplify, but if we look at the Church of England is a unique entity in denominational standards, in that it is part of the nation. The head of the Church of England would be the king. So it is a national organization. So when the U.S. is going to revolt against that and begin to form their own nation, the Church of England still represented the king. So you may still participate in that, but it's going to be hard to share with your neighbors that you're part of a movement of creating a new nation when you're supporting the nation that you're fighting against. There was some conflict that was there. And thus you have all the dissension that was between what was perceived as the colonists being lesser than the English-born citizens. So you did have a level of hierarchy or social structure that existed, that the Church of England was perceived by some as the church for the property owners and not the workers. Was there a formal break? The formal break would have been the calling, and I might lean on you just for a second, Dave, of the Christmas conference. There was a unique thing that happened. Wesley ordained, so to speak, a leader for the church here, without having Episcopal authority to do so. So the bishop didn't really do that. And then that started a separation. The Christmas conference thus set up a new structure for the itinerant pastors that were serving as Methodists, moving around, and began to adjust that control. Now Wesley still had some influence in there, but that would have been, I'd say that would be the pinnacle point of this is where we became two separate entities, no longer attached to the Church of England or its influence. And if you think about it, if you're the Church of England and you have a priest that just ordains somebody to serve as a bishop of sorts, that person's not going to be recognized, so anything they do isn't going to be recognized from the church.
What's something that people often get wrong about Methodists?
Oh. Did you have something in mind?
No, not at all.
It's unique. The Methodists are so broad. I guess if we're just speaking Methodist in general, if I wanted to put a little bit of tongue in cheek, the idea of the United Methodist Church, we're on the brink of the divide. United may be a little bit of a stretch. There's the idea of the Free Methodist being this free-wielding, partying denomination. It's an off-branch of the Methodist movement, and it's not true. It's based on the idea that you used to pay for your pew. And Free Methodists changed that up. In a lot of ways there's more tradition, and I don't like labels, but conservatism in that church than you'd see in the United Methodist. But maybe that we're not quite as uptight as having a book of discipline says. Discipline isn't a very comforting word by nature, but it is our ruling book. It's the book of discipleship, learning, teaching, guiding, strengthening. Is that all right?
So what happened with the African American Methodists?
I thought somebody might answer that. If anybody would like one of these, I actually have a timeline.
Absolutely.
The U.S. has a poor history of race and race relations, and churches were segregated. Although the Methodist movement and itinerant pastors, I'm trying to think of what date it was that there was an African American that was ordained a deacon. For some reason I'm thinking the early 1800s. I can't think exactly. But in a worship setting, the seats in the front of the church in almost all denominations are reserved for whites. African Americans, slaves, freed slaves, didn't matter, stood in the back of the church. If the church was so crowded that whites needed to stand, then the African Americans were pushed outside. When that was no longer going to be tolerated, then Allen branched out and began a movement in Philadelphia that then led into the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church. Then there was the AMEZ Church that was formed. There was the colored Protestant Church that later became the Christian Protestant. But you have that movement because the church was so broke that they accepted those rulings and divisions. It was also one of the reasons why the Methodist Church split over slavery and where we had the Methodist Episcopal Church South and the Methodist Episcopal Church. The Southern Church were still slave owners. The Methodist Episcopal Church, I'd like to say, were all non-slave owners, but there were some that still had household servants that were slaves by another name. So we're not free and clear on that. That church, we came back together in, I believe it was 39. Yeah, where we joined into the Methodist Church. At that point, in order to appease those who still were not accepting of diversity, inclusivity among races, we set up a central jurisdiction in the United States. That was the Methodist Church for blacks.
So then they African American Episcopal Zion Church, did they split then from the African American Church?
Yeah,
Or African American, no, African.
it was a similar
Yeah,
but distinct.
AME,
It was a
yeah.
similar but distinct movement. It wasn't a branch off necessarily of that. It was a creation it independently of.
One was in Philadelphia, one was in New York.
Yeah.
That was the
Oh.
AME Zion was primarily, but similar reasons, they were not welcomed or not given full
Okay,
rights.
so it wasn't okay, two separate responses to the
Right.
creation of
The way the timeline here works is if you have no connection to these starting points, then you were a start on your own. So if the African American Episcopal Zion, my tongue is getting tied, had been a branch off of the AME church, then it would have shown a split in the AME timeline, the way that's put together. That central jurisdiction in the United States for the black church, the Black Methodist Church, existed all the way up until they tried to begin to dissolve it in the 50s with different study groups. Anytime the Methodist Church wants to do anything, we form a task force study group. They have something to report back in another 4 years, and then often we ask for another report to give in another 4 years. Before that could be dissolved and that injustice rectified, the EUB and the Methodist merged in 1968. And one of the contingencies in that merger was you have to get rid of this racist act that you have done and have a church that's fully diverse and inclusive. So the 68 merger, in some ways, the EUB came alongside the Methodist and saved us from ourselves and opened our eyes that you're not going to solve racism, systemic racism in the life of the church by a task force.
Yeah, one of my colleagues along the way in the United Methodists came out of the EUB and was sharing his journey.
Yes. To that point, it's often been asked, me being the pastor at Garden City United Methodist Church, why is 6/10 of a mile away Monroeville United Methodist Church? Why are there two Methodist churches so close together, United Methodist churches? Garden City's roots are in the EUB tradition. So in the 68 merger, they became United Methodist. The Monroeville United Methodist is from the Methodist tradition, and during the merger, they became Monroeville United Methodist Church. So that's why you have two there. And when you walk into churches today, even though this is 68, there are traditions and ways of doing things sometimes in the churches that still reflect that EUB or Methodist origin. We have members, I said we have the open communion table, which is open to everybody without regard to anything. So children can come forward, toddlers can come forward. We believe that communion is a means to come in contact with God. Not that none of us can fully understand the sacrament of communion. So it's not an age level type of thing, but in the EUB tradition, it wasn't toddlers coming up. You were going to wait until your confirmation, your profession of faith to come forward to the table. So there's still some that have been there since the very beginning that whenever children's come forward, you can see in their eyes that it's, this isn't the way I was brought up, although they know this is the way that we do things, because there's that lingering tradition within us all.
Yeah. What's the history of the ordination of women in the various Methodists?
I'm trying to think when the first female was ordained in the Methodist Church. It was before the merger, if I'm correct. Is that correct?
Women were not given full clergy rights until 1956, but depending on that timeline, for example, the United Brethrens ordained women, but when they merged with the E's in 46, the evangelicals did not, and so women were not ordained then in the EUB church until later. So it depends on the particular tradition.
and also some of those things are driven by culture and what's going on around us. So as you see different movements in the secular world or in the political world, you're going to find those same movements in the church, often later. Yeah, it takes the church a while to catch on to anything, even with music. It takes us a while to catch on. But there's a guiding principle that we share in between.
Key into your deacon, ordained deacons. Do they remain deacons, or do they have the option of pathway to?
Methodist Church has a unique tradition with deacons too. We have a unique tradition with a lot of things, and each time we try to solve it, we make it more complex. Currently, ordained elders are to word, sacrament, order, the service. Deacons are to word and service. What we mean by the order of the church is the administration of the church. In the sacraments, an ordained deacon doesn't have sacramental privileges unless they are granted that by the bishop of that area for a certain service. But they are fully ordained. There's different education requirements. You can get a master's of theology rather than a master's of divinity as you're going on the path to the master's of divinity. If you're not going to serve the sacrament, you need to take all the classes on understanding the sacraments and the administration of the church if that's not going to be part of your ministry. Deacons are often in specialized ministry. Whether it's Christian education or social justice ministries, or you can find deacons as social workers, as psychologists, as in different areas. I had said earlier that we're appointed. Deacons have to find their own employment. It may be within the church or outside of the church. So they're not guaranteed a position. As an ordained elder, I'm guaranteed that they will find a church for me to serve somewhere.
So you're ordained and then appointed to someplace.
Yeah.
Not in our system. You need a call from a congregation as
Correct. Yeah. We also have local pastors that are licensed. They have education requirements that they have to go through. But often it's second, third career individuals that feel the call to ministry. But if you're entering into ministry at a particular time in life where you don't want to look at 4 years of undergrad, 4 years of seminary, so there's another route for you to go so you can still live out that call. Now, the privileges for a local pastor are just in that local church that you're appointed to. As I said before, the connectional system for a local pastor, once you're outside of that appointment setting, you're a layperson in respect to sacraments, but not in the sense of workload. Yeah, local pastors do the same work as every elder does, and oftentimes better. You can edit that part out. Yes.
You're a reverend doctor. What were your doctoral studies in?
Leadership excellence, specifically non-reductive physicalism.
Which
Ooh.
means?
Wow.
It means that my thesis was that mind, body, and spirit are all interwoven together, and we can't separate those in order to live out the fullness of our life. If you've heard the scientific studies that say that people who pray often heal quicker, I believe that people who keep themselves as healthy as possible are able to pray better, are able to fully commit and immerse themselves into things. So the reductive physicalism is that separation that exists, that here's the body's this and the spirit's this, which I believe they're interwoven together. That's the way we're created. Is not as two separate entities, but as one. That was my 50-cent word for the day. Thank you.
In those studies, in your study, was Native American perspective brought in?
Yeah. I read a lot of Native American traditions, and the as much as you can find from the culture itself that hasn't been Americanized, which is unique in itself. The church has not been good to Native Americans in general. United Methodist Church has issued apologies for many actions that we've taken over the course of the life of the church. So much so that the requirement of not having any Native American traditions included in a worship service, that's been lifted in many ways. Those things that are congruent with the faith are open and available now.
Well, I know that, this is a time where the church may be dividing, but are there any movements to unite any of these other branches currently? Or is that something that ever gets sort of...
Sadly, uniting the hurt that has been caused in the history of I believe, all denominations, but I can speak to the Methodist tradition, between the for lack of better terms, the central church, the wounds that have been created are so vast that until there's a full level of repentance that exists, I think it's a struggle to make that happen. Now, the Garden City itself is a blessing because we are a multicultural congregation, and it took a lot of work on the pastors that were there before me to make that a reality in which we exist. It's beautiful to see, but there's challenges that come up with having a diverse congregation. In some areas, it's easier, and in some ways, once churches have been apart since 1821, there's so many traditions that whenever you come together, whose traditions do you keep? How do you keep them all? How do you keep the structure going? Even though there's a lot of similarities in polity, there's enough difference to keep that dialogue from existing. Now, there are things that we do together, and work together as a larger organization. But
Okay. Well, thank you. Do we have any other questions right now? All right, then I will ask the $1,000,000 question. Does the Methodist Church have a strong position on tattoos?
no.
Okay.
My tattoos are a journey of life, and my tattoos have changed over the years. Most of the tattoos that you see are cover-ups of tattoos that existed before. Some of those are new. For instance, this one right here on my arm is 3 weeks old today. No, 3 weeks old tomorrow. Although the church doesn't have a particular stance on that, individual theologies can, but the beauty, that's one of the beauties about the Methodist Church is I can sit in communion and worship or at any aspect of the life of the church right next to somebody, loving them and them loving me if they can't stand my tattoos. So that's one of the things that the church, and I'm not saying we're the only church that does that type of thing, but it's one of the most asked things that I've gotten as I've gone into, whenever you go in for a take-in at a church, you're being appointed to a new church, I'm in a suit and a tie, and then the first time somebody sees me without that suit jacket on and short sleeve shirts, it's a shock. But I think it's a little bit of culture. Plus, there is some Navy background in me, which could
Okay.
explain some of that.
Well, thank you. Any additional questions before we wrap up? Or no? Okay, then I guess we'll end things here. Thank you all for coming, and thank you very
Appreciate
much,
it.
Reverend Gallagher.
Could you
Thanks,
announce the next one of these,
Oh.
please, if you would?
That is going to be.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you had the sheet.
I do not have it right in front of me, but I think Mark will grab one for me.
But in the meantime, I can announce, that's coming up this Sunday, February the 9th at 2 o'clock at the CCAC Boys Campus. We are participating and sharing in the work of Love Your Neighbor as Yourself, from the heart of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. This is a presentation that's going to be shared by Rabbi Ron Simons and Reverend Liddy Barlow. And there's some flyers up here for that.
Okay. The next meeting will be on March 5th. That is a Thursday at 7 p.m. The representative will be Sukha Singh by Sahib Sukha Singh of the Sikh faith. All right. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.